Welcome. We're glad you're here. Again, I'm Barbara Jo Lemiatis, Program and Outreach Services Supervisor here at the Estes Valley Library. Thank you for joining us to hear Bob Kull talk about his year in the wilderness of solitude off the coast of Chile. This program is part of our One Book, One Valley series. Every January, we in the Estes Valley celebrate community and reading by coming together in conversation around a single book. This year's book is A Stranger in the Woods, the extraordinary story of the Last True Hermit. As those who have read the book now, one of the major themes is solitude, and tonight's program is part of an exploration of that theme. I'll introduce Bob momentarily, but first, our usual disclaimer. We'd like to remind everyone that the library sees part of its job as bringing in speakers to share their own perspectives for the enrichment of our community. Speakers' perspectives are purely their own, and we don't tell them what to say, and you don't want us to. Now, I'd like to introduce Bob. Born in Ventura, California, Bob Kull has spent years wandering North and South America, working as a scuba instructor, travel guide, construction worker, logger, community organic gardening teacher, truck driver, bartender, dishwasher, firefighter, photographer, and professor. In 1985, he lost his lower right leg after a motorcycle crash in the Dominican Republic. He began undergraduate studies at the age of 40 and now holds his PhD from the University of British Columbia. To get that PhD, he wrote his dissertation about a year spent alone on an island off a rainy, windswept Pacific coast of southern Chile, exploring the physical, emotional, and spiritual effects of deep wilderness solitude. That dissertation later became a book, Solitude, Seeking Wisdom in Extremes, about his experience. Bob currently lives in Vancouver, British Columbia, so let's all welcome him now.
Hello, it's good to be here. Just as some housekeeping, my intention in this talk is not to talk about the year I spent alone in the wilderness. It's rather to lure you to go with me, to seduce you into a visit, to spend the time with me in the wilderness. For that reason, it will probably be better if you turn off your chat window during the slides and then just turn it back on at the question and answer period if you feel comfortable doing that. So as Barbara Jo said, I came to university late, and when I was 29, I guess it was, I spent 3 months alone in the wilderness here in British Columbia, and it was a very intense experience. I almost didn't make it back out. I almost went crazy out there. But I did make it back out, and some remarkable things, transformations of consciousness happened while I was out there. And I decided that someday I'd like to spend a year alone in the wilderness. 25 years passed, and I was teaching diving in the Caribbean when a drunk farmer wiped me out on my motorcycle. I ended up in the hospital for most of a year, and when I came out, I was having trouble walking. And so I started university, undergrad. I thought, well, maybe I'll switch from the physical activity to mental. And eventually I ended up working all my way through to a PhD. One of the difficulties in my undergraduate years going in as a mature student is I felt there was no place for me there as a human being, as a full person. Anytime I would say, well, I think or I feel, the professor would say, well, I'm not really interested in what you think or feel, just learn the facts and the theories. So when I started my PhD, I got a great committee together and I said, okay, I have a couple of bottom lines here. At first, I was planning to study some biological organism other than myself in the wilderness. And then I switched and I realized that the organism that interested me most was myself and the effects of deep wilderness solitude on a human being. And so I negotiated with my committee and I said, well, I have one bottom line is I get to spend a year alone in the wilderness, and that'll be the basis of my dissertation. And the second condition is that I get to bring all of myself into this process, not just the intellect, but also my emotions, my physicality, and even my spirituality. And so we agreed, and that was the format for this exploratory year in the wilderness. So the retreat was a combination of social science research and spiritual practice, a spiritual retreat. And so that's kind of the larger context for what we're going to be exploring tonight together. Let's see if this works. It theoretically is. So if not, please let me know. I'll be doing a combination of journal readings from my wilderness journal, my daily journal, and storytelling from the present moment. So my voice changes some during the readings, and so that's what I'm reading. When it sounds like I'm reading, I actually am. Coming into wilderness solitude is like studying where everyone speaks a language you have forgotten so long ago. It now seems completely foreign. You know you have something important to learn, but you don't understand. It takes patience to keep listening and listening. I hear the voices of nature and try to translate what I hear into conceptual thought language, so I will know I understand in my mind. But the language of nature cannot be translated into human concepts. It's deeper and different. I realize I have heard and understood when my heart softens and opens to love and peace and beauty around and within me. This drawing by Escher is one of my favorites, and it's a wonderful depiction of why I go into wilderness solitude. In the drawing, we see two individual humans, and they're both looking at the same sphere in front of their eyes. But it's clear they can never see the same sphere. Either they're in a different position, or if they change positions, they're at a different time. And so from that perspective, each of us is living isolated in our own individual world. We're not in a world full of others, we're in our own world. And from that, it's pretty lonely if we stop and think about it, that we're stuck inside our own experience. But up here, we see that the ribbons that make these two people up are intertwined. And so there's the possibility of communication through words, through song, through dance, through art. And we can evoke in others our experience and share our experience that way. So we're not so fundamentally alone. Down here, we see beneath the layer of language and conceptualization and conceptual thinking, we can see that these two individuals are not individual at all. They're manifestations of an underlying unity. And not only them, but all the spheres within which they float, all is part of this fundamental underlying unity. And it's that unity that I go into the wilderness alone to explore. Studying myself in solitude was a little tricky to get through the university because it's such a purely subjective exploration. And I argued that if I really wanted to study the experience of solitude, I had to do it myself. I had to study myself in solitude. Because if I studied somebody else in solitude, they wouldn't be in solitude anymore. And if I read other solitaries' writings, I'd be getting a second-hand experience rather than my own first-hand experience. So I was kind of in the position of this boy depicted in another Escher drawing, this boy in an art gallery. He's standing in an art gallery and he's looking at a painting. This painting includes the city behind. And in the city, we follow the eye around. There's this woman leaning on her window ledge. And then we follow it around and we realize that the city also includes this art gallery and the boy in it. So the boy is part of what he's looking at. In looking at this picture, the world, the boy is changed by the experience of looking. And because he's part of the city, the world, he changes the world because he is changed. And so the process is very circular. It goes around and around. Neither the subject nor the researcher holds still through any of it. So that's the condition I was in. and working to make this a social science study as well as an adventure, a retreat. And the way I approached it was to tell about this experience as a storyteller. So my dissertation is a narrative. Out of the dissertation came my book, Solitude, Seeking Wisdom in Extremes. So rather than attempting to write a conceptual piece, a fundamentally conceptual piece, I wrote it as a narrative. And in between the months of the narrative, we'll get there in a minute. Sorry, I'm having trouble with this. Okay. There are academic parts to the dissertation as well, but the fundamental basket for it, the context, is this year of solitude, a narrative about the year of solitude. So to some logistics. I began up here in Vancouver, Canada. I shipped my stuff and I traveled by air down to northern Chile and then by land down through Argentina to southern Chile. There's no roads going up the coasts of southern Chile down here. This is my camp. This is the border between Chile and Argentina. And this whole area, and then far, a couple of hundred, almost 2,000 miles north, there's just nobody living down there. Not 2,000, probably 1,000. There's nobody living. There, the odd fishing community, and for a while, me. And so I left down here and caught a ride up to a town called Puerto Natales, and then the Chilean Navy took me in. I wanted to be 100 miles or so from the nearest human habitation because I knew that it takes me about that much before I feel really out there on my own, that I'm not kind of hanging on in the suburbs on the edge of civilization, that if I really wanted to just be alone with myself in the wilderness, that's the distance I needed to go. So this little island they dropped me off is so small, it's not even marked on the map. I just put that dot there. The Chilean Navy took me in. The Chilean Navy were absolutely amazing. They were incredible. They took me in, they dropped me off with all my gear, mountain of gear, and then a year later, they brought my friend Patty in to spend a month with me to help me back to be with people. And then they came back for both of us and all our gear a month after that. So they carried us, all my gear and me, in on their inflatable boat. And when they were doing this, I noticed they were all wearing survival suits and I wasn't. And I thought, this may have been an oversight in my planning because the water down there is always cold. This is the tip of South America, and the ocean froze at times in the winter around my cabin. I don't like to do much research before I go to a place. I like to arrive at a place kind of naive, ignorant. And so when I travel around people, I never use a tour guide. I just go and talk to local people. And so I did the same here, and I got there and I saw there was this grass and I assumed it was above the high tide line. So I set my tent up on the grass, and in the dark, it was a rainy, vicious, windy night, and the tide kept coming up closer and closer to the tent. And I politely asked it to stop. And then I swore at it to stop. I insisted that it stop, and then I prayed to it. And it was the first time in the year that I really got a direct sense that I'm not in charge here. I have to figure out how to survive in the context of this environment and adapt to it, to surrender to it. So after that night, I built this platform up above the tide line, covered it with tarp, and set my tent up. And this is where I lived for a month and a half, 2 months, while I was building my more permanent shelter. All during this slide is taken later in the year because it's a great shot of the rough ocean coming in. But at first, when I got there, there was no snow yet on the mountains. But this is what the ocean looked like the majority of the time. That southern tip of South America hangs further down in the globe than almost any place else. And so the wind whistles around the earth and smacks up against that west coast of Chile. And the winds are ferocious down there. The Chilean government tried to tell me, but I said, I know weather. I've lived on the west coast of Vancouver Island. It turned out I didn't yet know weather. It also rained a ton of the time. This is summer. I went in the summer because I thought that would be the nicest time of year. It turned out to be the windiest and wettest time of year. What a storm last night. A whole universe of noise, groans and roars, whistles and shrieks from the wind, surf pounding on the rocks, rain on the tarps. I feel like an alien in this watery world. All the creatures here seem to be water beings. This morning, vague tendrils of terror crept through me. This is the existential angst that arises in solitude. Alone, a tiny speck, completely vulnerable in the face of an infinite universe intent on my annihilation. I feel myself tighten against the anxiety, but know that only by surrendering to my own suffering and death will the clenching fear dissolve. Only by letting the world come in and by flowing out to meet it. The tools I used to build my shelter were simple, or no electricity, of course. I had a chainsaw, a sweet saw, a square, machete, wonder bar, tape, and hammer. And I lived in rain gear for the year. If it wasn't actively raining, the wind was blowing, and the rain gear was the only thing that would cut the cold wind, or everything was wet. And so building the shelter in rain gear is kind of a pain, but I got it up. I took enough plywood for the floor and for the roof. And then the rest was 2x2s and 2x4 framing. And I covered the outside with tarp and the inside of the 2x2s with plastic. And that created a dead air space that acted as insulation. So my plan was to staple the tarp on the outside of the frame. And it was a really good plan. I took a staple gun and 2,000 staples. And when I got them out, I discovered that I'd taken the wrong size staples for the staple gun. It was not a happy discovery. So I had to take these 2,000 staples apart one by one and pull the tarp tight, because if it flapped in the wind, it would have driven me crazy. Hold the tarp tight, hold this tiny little staple, and drive it in with a hammer. In the meantime, my fingers were taped up with duct tape because they were split to the quick from the wet and the cold and very painful. So I kept smacking my fingers with the hammer. And it was an opportunity to expand the creative limits of my profanity. I came up with whole new strings of words I'd never thought of attaching to each other. And there I'd be working along on a peaceful, rainy afternoon, and all of a sudden these screams of profanity echoing down the rock walls of Staines Peninsula, and I'd sometimes pause and wonder what the animals around me were thinking. So this is the shelter when it was finished, just above the high tide line. At super high tides, come up a little bit around the piles of firewood covered with tarp. It was 10 feet wide, plus a 5 feet wide, 4 feet wide, 5 feet wide porch, and then 10 feet deep. And the porch had a roof to keep out of the rain, but it was an open view of the Andes Mountains. The kayak, inflatable kayak, I spent a lot of time out in the kayak fishing. At this point, I had already cleared rocks off the beach. When I got there, the whole beach looked like this. And so for the first while, I left my inflatable boat anchored out in this little cove. And I thought it was protected. It was protected from the predominant winds. But one night, the winds shifted and blew right into the cove. And when I woke up at first light, I saw that my inflatable boat was flipped and my outboard motor was drowned in the salt water. And that's probably the worst thing you can do for an outboard motor. So I'm not a mechanic, but I had a manual with me and I dragged everything ashore and I took the motor apart as much as I could with the tools I had, and I flushed it with fresh water and let it dry, and then started it up, and it actually ran. It was just a miracle, because I had these visions of how it was going to be stuck there with no boat to bring in firewood to go out fishing and like that. So just as we go through the year, be aware that anytime I was out in the boat, I felt really at risk because the motor never really worked right, and I didn't know if it was going to die at any moment. The inside of the cabin was great. I made it exactly as I wanted it. Storage space was at a premium, so there were shelves everywhere I could tuck them. I had a long horizontal stovepipe, so I'd get as much heat out of the wood as possible, and I could hang clothes behind it to dry out because it was so wet, it was hard to dry anything. I had to keep the wood on the porch. I split it and then kept it on the porch and eventually moved it inside because I had to dry it out before it would burn. This shot is taken late in the year. It was one of the few sunny blue days that I was actually just in a t-shirt. And I climbed up to the top of a hill on another island behind the one I was on to get this kind of panoramic view of where I was. And my cabin was hidden here on this little cove. It's hidden behind the trees here because the predominant wind direction is out of the northwest this way. So I had to hide my cabin out of the wind. Unfortunately, in the winter, the sun goes in the north down there instead of the south as it does here. And so my camp was in shade for the whole winter as well, which made it a lot colder than it otherwise would have been. You can see that as soon as you leave sea level, it turns into bare rock. But down here at sea level, it's very thick. The vegetation is incredibly thick. This island was about 250 meters by maybe 100, 150 maybe. And I crossed it just one time. It took me an hour and a half. I did a lot of it on my hands and knees because I'd be kind of walking along a fallen tree, holding on, and I'd find a little spot in the brush where I could see down, and I was 10 feet in the air that this tree trunk had fallen across two rocky ledges, and I was over the open space in between. I wouldn't agree with my committee. I wouldn't commit to any kind of methodology when I was there. I wouldn't commit to even keeping a daily journal. I eventually did, but I said, no, my only commitment is that I'll go to this little island and I'll sit there for a year and see what happens. So I was treating it as a meditation retreat where you sit on the cushion and you see what happens. You don't plan your sits, you just see what happens and you're open to whatever the world brings you. I had to take a satellite phone. The university insisted I take a satellite phone so I could check in once a month. And then if I really ran into problems, if I hurt myself badly, I could call for help, and the Chilean Navy, if it wasn't storming too badly, would come and get me. And I also took a laptop. And so I did a lot of my daily journaling just in a notebook, but I did a lot on this laptop as well. So as I said, my dissertation took the form of a narrative, just that it was based mostly on the daily journal, edited daily journal that followed the year. And then in between the months of the journal, I had interludes. And this was the academic part, the conceptual part. And so I really, in doing this writing, the journal writing, it was both a powerful practice in um, pushing me to pay close attention to everything that was going on. Because I think, well, I'm going to maybe be writing about this tonight. And so I'd really notice details and not just let the world kind of slide past. So that was really a powerful aspect of it. But there was another piece too that in some sense, when I was writing, I wasn't fully alone. I wasn't completely in solitude. I was writing for a reader. And even if that reader was me in the future, I wasn't just present. And so that was an interesting kind of juxtaposition of energy and experience in the writing of the journal. In some sense, pouring out into this journal all that's happening to me as though it's of great importance seems arrogant. Narcissism is an issue in lived experience, personal research, and writing. How to report one's own life without it becoming self-involved crap. How do I give my personal experience not more objectivity, but a broader perspective so it might have relevance to others? I recall, as from a place and time far away and half forgotten, the essay I wrote for my PhD qualifying exam, a proposal to investigate the experience of solitude. Now my world has shrunk to this small beach and stretch of water, to what I'll eat for lunch, to pain. How can this become a dissertation? Fishing links me deeply with the earth and water. There's a wonderful sense of generosity in the gift of food. Catch and release fishing makes no sense to me. Fishing isn't a sport, it's spiritual communion with the non-human world. And so a regular task was to be out fishing and catching fish, mostly red snapper, for both me and the cat. I took a cat with me. It wasn't my intention, but the Chilean park said that if I wanted to eat shellfish, mussels, or clams, I should take a cat because there's red tide in the area. And I wouldn't have access to the government testing programs. And so what locals do is they feed suspect shellfish to a cat. And if the cat gets sick or dies, they don't eat it themselves. And so they said, if I planned to eat any of the shellfish, I needed to take a cat and test it out. It didn't work. The cat and I became very close. And so it was, instead of cat testing shellfish for me, I was catching fish for cat, because to use them as kind of a test organism was kind of like, if you come home from school or work and you don't feel like cooking and you open the fridge and there's some old leftovers in the back and you give them a smell and they don't smell quite right. You think they're probably okay, but you're not sure. And so you call over your kid or your little brother and sister and give them the leftovers to them to test out for you. And that's sort of what it felt like if I were going to do that with cat. And so I never did use him to test out suspect shellfish. He was a very strong personality. He was a tomcat. He'd never been touched until I captured him for the parks to give him when he was a baby kitten. So he was about half wildcat, but he was also extremely vocal. It was incredible. I've never heard any cat make the same amount of different kinds of noise that this cat made. And one day he made a sound that stopped me in my tracks, and I thought, if rotting meat could make a sound, that's what this rotting meat would sound like. He'd get right in the middle of whatever I was doing and drive me completely bonkers. And he'd cry a lot. He was just very vocal. And so I'd be trying to meditate or read, and Cat is yowling. Cat is being a jerk today, moaning for no apparent reason, trying to climb on me. My first reaction is tell him to shut up, but I do my complaining in these pages, and he has only his voice. He seems to get this way when I'm filled with loneliness and longing. Why do I accept whatever the ducks, eagles, and kingfishers do, but am offended by some of Cat's behaviors? I think it has to do with a sense of ownership. This is a problem in all my relationships. The most serious case is with myself. I feel I somehow own myself and have the right to control what I do, what I feel, and what happens to me. From there, it follows that the world is mine to do with as I wish, but I don't own the world. I belong to it. So Kat and I did not always get along. We had some pretty intense arguments, and there was a lot of anger, I think, on both sides. Pain was a profound part of this experience. I was always in pain, physical, emotional, psychological. I'm so tired of falling down. I hurt everywhere. I think I've torn the rotator cuff of my shoulder. The rocks out front are so slippery with microalgae. I want the world to fuck off and give me a break. I feel like I'm starting to lose it, starting to see the rock out front as actively malevolent, watching and waiting for the chance to harm me. I project my pain and fear onto the world so I can have the illusion of escape. But there will be other pain and other fear, and the need to escape will never end. My task is to make peace with the pain and fear. After I'd been there about 7 months, one of my teeth abscessed. and it started to really hurt badly, and I knew it had to come out. It was an upper front tooth, and it freaked me out because my teeth have roots that go down forever. And so I was like, okay, I either have to use the sat phone and call for the Chilean Navy to come and get me and take me to a dentist, or I have to pull the tooth myself. And I knew that they'd promised to bring me right back if they did come to get me, but I also knew that that was not going to happen, that I might eventually make it back, but the Solitude experiment would be over if I left to get the tooth worked on. So I accepted that I was going to have to pull it, and I was really afraid. I was just scared. I don't like fear, and I don't like pain, you know. And so I was just like, ew, I don't want to do this. So I sent an email to my friend Patty, who was my main contact person. Our protocol was not to exchange emails during the year. I had a check-in group, but I didn't want to know anything about the world at all during this year. So I didn't find out about 9/11 until 5 months later, because I really wanted to just be present out there. But I broke that protocol and I sent Patty an email. She's a nurse, and so was a nurse, and so was trained medical. And I said, my tooth is abscessed and I have to pull it. And I'm really scared. I know it's going to hurt like crazy. I'm just really scared. And she wrote back this brilliant email. And it said, tie a string to the tooth, tie the other end of string to the door, slam the door. Stop being such a wuss. Stop bugging me. People have been pulling their teeth for thousands of years. It's no big deal. Pull it, get on with your life. And I read that and I was inspired. I went, yeah, I can do this. It was great. Back in Texas, she's going, oh God, he's got to pull a tooth. This is terrible. The problem was I didn't have a door heavy enough to slam. And so I thought about it and I decided what I would do was I tie the tooth to a string, and then I tie the other end of the string to a heavy rock, and I drop the rock, and that would yank the tooth out. So being a bit anal retentive, I had to find the perfect tooth pulling rock. It had to be heavy enough to yank the tooth out. Because imagine tying it on, dropping it, having it yank, but not pull the tooth out, and then having to do it again. I thought, oh, that would be horrible. So I got this really big rock, and it had to have texture so the string wouldn't slip off. So I finally was all set up. I took a couple of Tylenol 3s and smeared some Orajel on my gum. I took off my shirt so I wouldn't get splattered with blood, tied the string to my tooth and the other end to the rock, left enough slack that it would fall but not hit the floor before it yanked the tooth out, and I'm ready to go. I leaned forward, teeth out. It was an upper other, and I holding the rock in my hands. I said, okay, Bob, it's time to drop the rock. Bob, it's okay to be afraid, but you've got to drop the rock now. Bob, drop the rock. I noticed that that message wasn't getting through to my fingers. And the reason was that there was another voice in the back of my mind, and it was saying, I don't think so. I never did drop the rock. What I did do was tie the other end of the string to the table leg nailed to the floor, and then I pulled up with my neck muscles and pulled out the tooth. And I got to say, it hurt a lot more in thinking about it than it did in actually doing it. Eventually, I had the cabin built and I moved in. Winter set in. Slowly, I'm relaxing and healing. Not the earth-shattering transformation I'd expected, but the ebb and flow of solitude carrying me along month after month. Why do I resist this opening so? It feels beforehand like a negation, like death. But once caught in the flow of the universe, there is the joy of belonging and participation. Without the direct lived experience of death, I cannot feel truly alive. since death is always part of life. This afternoon, I was listening to the quiet sounds of the water. Each sound was unique and seemed to be the sea saying, I am this, and this, and this. I closed my eyes and followed the sound into the universe and felt myself float free. Clarity of mind is not enough without love. I was a member of the Sweat Lodge at University of British Columbia, the Indigenous Sweat Lodge, for years before I went. And so I continued the practice in solitude that I would set up my lodge and build a fire and heat stones and go in the lodge at the same time they were doing it in Vancouver. It was a really powerful part of my spiritual practice while I was there. It was also a ton of work and it was one of the times I realized most clearly what a challenge it is to live alone, how much work it is to do everything for yourself. If there had been more people, we could have split up the work. But it was wonderful. I'd come out feeling cleansed, warm. It was one of the few times I actually felt warm during the year. And there'd sometimes be eagles flying overhead or dolphin out front. I can't see any way to teach how others how to have this experience. It just seems like a long, long personal journey with no clear directions home. Like a child growing up, our spiritual lives need to be lived one day at a time. I can't imagine many people would want to follow this kind of pathless land, and so I can't see how this experience will have much impact on the environmental issues. We often seem to believe we are isolated beings who need to come into relationship with each other through social interactions. But we're more profoundly social than that. We are part of the human matrix in our consciousness, whether alone or with other people. I'm working to open myself to a deeper level of connectedness that doesn't depend on surface relationships. To be fully human, we need to cultivate the awareness that we are also spiritual beings. Solitude can be a powerful catalyst in this process. Time is a worm, a caterpillar, a grub. Minutes creep into days, days trudge toward the end of the week, then lost in the long gray sleep of our absence, a sudden startling shift, a transformation. Years have flown and carried us toward the implacable moment of death. Are you remembering to remember, to pause and notice the life living in you, to feel the tender autumn light flicker across your waters, to drift with the clouds and mist, the mountains and canyons of your soul, to float in the ebb and flow of joy and sorrow, love and grief through the wide, empty basin of your heart? All through the winter, when the days were cold and short, but there was no wind, I dreamed of going to a distant glacier. Years before in Argentina, I'd seen a glacier calving off huge chunks of ice into a lake, and it was so impressive. But I was surrounded by other people chattering and taking photographs. And I really wanted to go and see this happen by myself. But I was frightened. I was frightened of the unexpected storms that would come up once the days were long enough for me to go. I was frightened that my motor would crap out. I'd be caught on some windswept rocks with no boat, no way, my satellite phone flooded. And I just was struggling with fear all through the winter. And knowing that if I left this year without going to the glacier, that I'd always feel like I'd failed in an important task of facing my fear. And so I planned out a route and leaving the cabin and going up this way, and then coming to this glacier, and then coming back. And here, coming out to this little island called Vancouver Island, which is a place in this inlet I considered going for the year, and then back home. And the whole trip was a little bit less than 200 miles. And so it was a huge challenge to get myself to actually do this, but I determined that I was going to do it. And so I loaded my boat. I had extra gas, the inflatable kayak, food for 10 days. And I took everything I thought I would need. And I took off. It was a clear, calm day. And within 20 minutes, the ocean looked like this. An unexpected storm rolled in from the west. And I had to turn around and go back to my camp. And I was freaked out by this, thinking, well, what if I'd been in completely unexposed water? But I was determined to go. And so I waited until the weather cleared up again. And the next time the weather held for the trip. And these next slides are the trip to the glacier. So this is on the way to the glacier. This is the ocean. This isn't a lake. When I got to the glacier, I couldn't get as close as I'd hoped because of all these little floating icebergs. But it was still astonishing. I turned the boat motor off and just floated there. And I felt both more in the middle of nowhere and also most deeply intertwined with the universe, maybe, than I'd felt before. And something else happened too. I had expectations when I went into this year of solitude. I knew I shouldn't. Part of my proposal was that I'd go without expectations, but of course I carried them with me based on the 3 months I'd spent alone when I was in my late 20s. And I thought I'd come out here and I'd spend maybe 3 hard months struggling with myself, getting all set up, and then I'd just be blissed out. I'd be woven into the universe. I'd find enlightenment. And it didn't happen. I kept going through these cycles of times of just wonder and feeling woven into the universe. And then I'd crash into depression and anxiety and darkness again. And these cycles would go on and on. And it was really upsetting me. I thought I was doing something wrong. And it was here at the glacier on this trip that I finally accepted that everything that goes on within me is part of who I am. I'm not just a being of light. I have dark shadows and demons within as well. And it's developing the equanimity to be with all aspects of that, all aspects of life, that's the real challenge. I also discovered that what I was searching for most profoundly was this feeling of being alive, being fully alive, and that I have that always. I don't need to go anywhere else to find it. There's nothing else out there in the world more than wherever I am. And so my task, my practice is to learn to be as present as possible in each moment, no matter where I am, whether I'm off on an adventure or sitting at home in my little apartment. And that's the challenge, is to live each moment as fully as possible. Once I made it back to my camp, I didn't leave again. But here at the glacier, I was joined by a pod of dolphins. And it was just wonderful. It was just this magical gift that these dolphins came and swam around my boat for a while. And at the glacier, I realized that I hadn't just been pushed to go there by my own fear, wanting to face my fear, but there had been something else calling to me. And that something was this mystic blue of glacier ice. I'd seen it before, and it's the only color in it that I've ever experienced that seems to go straight into my eyes, into my heart, and brings this profound sense of integration and healing. And it was this memory of this glacier ice, this mystic blue of glacier ice that had been calling me to go. After the trip, I didn't go anywhere in the boat except for close by. And then in the last couple of months, I didn't fire up the outboard or the chainsaw at all. I just couldn't deal with any noise. And so anytime I left my little beach, I went out in the kayak. I drop my notebook and feel myself sink more deeply into the world. All desire to write disappears. What has happened to my flow of language? I sit here and fall mute before wonder and beauty. I try to describe the delicate shades of shifting color as wind swirls water around immovable rock. But the images feel dull and trite. Each word falls like lead into this living world. There's no dance between word and world, only frustrated, clumsy stumbling as my words march, static and stiff, in lines across the page. But sometimes I also notice that it's words, some kinds of words, spoken to myself or read, that shift me from small, tight mind to big, spacious mind. So words themselves are not a prison, but only certain uses of them. A lot of densely packed analytic words tend to tighten my mind. A few lyrical words often open an inner space. The frog calls, and I hear life calling to life, telling me that I too belong here. Yet more and more, I must admit, I know less and less. It may be hard to turn this realization into a PhD thesis, but that's okay too. This is worth so much more. So during the heavy winds, I would watch seagulls and condors playing in the wind, and I wanted to play with the wind too. The wind had felt like an adversary, a dangerous enemy, and I wanted to shift that relationship. And so I decided I would build a kite. I remembered back when I was a boy, my father had shown me how to build a kite. And I built a series of kites, and they all crashed. None of them would fly until finally one crashed so hard that the crosspiece broke. And then it flew. And I realized I hadn't put enough bend in the crosspiece. And so then I built kites that actually flew, and I had this long tail on them because the wind out there, I was on the windy point, I could barely stand up against it. It wasn't a little light breeze, it was these huge windstorms I was flying the kite in. And I hooked it up to my fishing rod and I let out long lines, sometimes 200 meters of line, and the kite would be spinning and swirling and dipping. Occasionally it would crash in the sea, but I made it out of tarp so it didn't get destroyed. I could slowly pull it in and fly it again. And when it would disappear in the clouds sometimes, the line was just heading into the sky, and it's as if I was sky fishing for the wind with a kite, an imaginary kite, my lure, the ultimate of catch and release. This is the condor kite I made. I painted it with a feather I found on the beach. And I wanted to give something back to the sky and to the condors. And so I made this kite. It seems to me the most parsimonious theory about anything is none. Everything just is as it is. Of course, that's not very satisfying intellectually. It's not that conceptual knowledge is meaningless, but if it doesn't emerge from and lead back to direct lived experience, knowledge becomes a deadening prison. My closest neighbors were these flightless steamer ducks. They were just amazingly creative creatures. I watched as they mated and had chicks. And then I watched as a local eagle wiped out all the chicks because the eagle had a chick of its own back in its nest to feed. And it was one of the hardest parts of the year. These chicks are incredibly cute, and to just watch them disappear one by one was really hard. That implacable aspect of the non-human world. Small mind is the mind I usually live in. It's the mind of personal concerns, of repetitive memories and plans, of rehearsing things. And it's tight. It feels tight often. There's anger, frustration. Sometimes there's happiness, there's desires. And then there's a shift to big mind, this big spacious mind. And one of the things I went into solitude for this time was to learn to control that shift, that I was going to figure out how I could control that shift in myself. And then when I figured it out, I could teach others how to make that shift as well, because there's nothing for me as meaningful as that shift into big mind, of feeling to be part of the universe. I notice different experiences when I slip free from small mind into big mind. Usually I experience a quiet, empty space within which there are feelings, thoughts, sounds, and physical sensations. There is love for the world and for myself, peace and beauty. More rarely, there is the sense of myself as other, as though seen from beyond, just a man in the world who belongs here as one being among many, all of us alive together. Softly, everything comes alive. Ah, yes, this is it. All existence together, alive. Experientially, a tree, a rock, a bird is not alive because those things are conceptually created fragments, and concepts are not alive. Only the whole pulsating cosmos is alive and sacred. What's the meaning and reason for our living? Only this: life is its own meaning, nothing to get out of it, and nowhere to take anything to. The rock walls of Staines Peninsula are full of faces. Even though I realize they're projections of my mind, viscerally I experience them as beings that live in the rock. Each day I bow to them and to the wind, which has become my most profound teacher. Where are we trying to go with our striving and incessant activity? To the stars? But we're already as among the stars as we will ever be. Better quality of life, the quality we seek, is lost in the seeking. Truly, we have it backwards, with our continual reaching for what we don't have and avoiding what we do. What we crave most deeply, we have always had. We are life. In some sense, environmentalism, with its focus on physical sustainability, is not asking the deeper question: how can we sustain not only our own lives, but also the life of the land, and reestablish our sense of belonging and longing for the sacred? Each of us must search within for our own answer, and the answer won't be conceptual, but how we live our lives. I spend much of my time now meditating, watching the tide and my breath flow in and out. seeing what desire and aversion do to the mind, how wanting things to be different than they actually are closes me off from living fully in the present moment. The process is often difficult. There is darkness and anger and grief. There is pain. But there are also times of radiant joy, times when wonder fills the world, times when I want to never leave here. The night was still, and I awoke to a silent dawn. I sat and soaked in the silence, and in the faint murmur of a tiny stream a little ways away. In that quiet moment, I felt the process of my time here come to completion. I knew the cycles of ups and downs, joy, peace, doubt, fear, aversion will continue, but they, for me at least, are part of the flow of the universe, the fabric of my life. And then the year was over. The Chilean Navy brought in my friend Patty to spend a month with me and help me to be with people again. The Chilean parks said that I should leave the shelter set up in case there was a shipwreck or somebody else wanted to go there. But already after just a year, the strong summer southern sun was deteriorating the tarp, and I knew that before long it would be tatters blowing all over and leaving a huge mess. There was something else too. I didn't want to make it easy for someone else to go there. Coming into raw wilderness and building a world for myself had been a joyful challenge, and I didn't want to take that from someone else. I didn't want to make it easy for anyone else. Also, I didn't want to spread the human hegemony. One of the ways that we humans spread the human hegemony is to name everything. So people have asked what I named this little rock, this little island. I didn't give it a name. I left its own name. I left it with its own name. The sound of the wind and the birds and the water, that's its name. And so I tore the camp completely down to try to leave as light a footprint as possible. We burnt the wood, bundled up, and took with us all the tarp and trash. I'd collected a lot of trash over the year on windy beaches where that had kind of drifted in from the main seaway out to the west. And so it was kind of like a Tibetan sand mandala where they spend days, weeks creating this incredibly intricate design. And then when they're finished, they wipe their hand through it to celebrate transience. And it was the same for me. I built a world for myself. And then in leaving, I wanted to take it all down and give the world back to itself. I'd come as a visitor and hoped I'd been a good guest while I was there. I tried to build the shelter in my camp to be harmonious, to be beautiful to my eye and heart. And it was a joy to tear it back down and give the non-human world back to itself. Low tide rock city, listening for the voice of God. Then the soft, subtle shift. My whole being relaxed, and I was listening, am now, and always have been, to the voice of God in every sound. Such a small difference from 4 to 2, yet massive. In one I strain for what isn't. In the other I find peace in the wonder of what is. Listening for the voice of God implies duality, as though whatever I'm experiencing is somehow not the voice of God. I spend so much time and energy listening for the voice of God with my mind, but I listen to the voice of God with my heart. My mind has definite ideas about what it wants God's voice to say. It wants answers, certainty, conceptual understanding. My heart hears God's voice saying, I am, and it is peaceful and content.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you so much for sharing your experience with us this evening, for great thoughts to think about. I'd like to remind everyone online who's joining us that we're accepting questions via chat. You're also able to raise your hand via Zoom, and I will unmute your microphone so you can ask your question in person if you prefer. Give everyone a couple minutes to ruminate on these deep thoughts that Bob has shared with us and his experience, but happy to take questions at any point. Good question here. Did you bring your cat home, Bob?
Oh, well, the wind was more ferocious than I expected it would be. And towards the end of the year, there was a long period when I couldn't get out to go fishing. I was stuck on the shore, and I ran out of food, and I had to eat the cat. It was really hard. But no, that's not true. That's a lie. Um, when Patty came, we talked about it, and the Chilean national parks wanted me to leave Cat with them because they had a place where there was out in the middle of nowhere because Cat didn't know about traffic. And so they wanted me to leave Cat with them when I went back to Canada. But Cat didn't know Spanish. I'd only taught Cat English. And so Patty and I talked about it and decided that she would take Cat with her. She used to live in rural Texas. She's died 6 years ago now. But she took Cat with her. We got him all the shots and everything. And then he was kind of pampered because he was a tough cat, but he lived inside and slept on their bed for a couple of weeks. And then via email, I was in a town down there. We decided it was time for Cat to go outside, that he really was a free spirit and needed the freedom to wander. And so he came and went for a couple of weeks, and then he just didn't come back anymore. And Patty drove around all the roads to see if he'd been wiped out by a car, and she couldn't see anything. It's hard to know what happened. Cat had epilepsy from a young age, and I didn't even know cats could get epilepsy, and that was a surprise to discover that. And I discovered later that when cats get epilepsy young, they don't live very long, and so he could have died from epilepsy. It's also possible that a predator got him. There are wild hogs in Texas. There are coyotes, and he didn't know from predators. He was the only major predator on the island except me. And so it's possible that a predator got him. It's also possible for years, I used to wonder whether he was looking for me, whether he was looking for the sea. And that was kind of an open wound. But if he was, I hope that he was having a joyful life wherever he was, because he was quite an amazing creature. He taught me a lot. He and the wind taught me a huge amount about the world and about myself. So there were times when, he'd get right up close and sniff me from about half an inch away, get his nose right up to my face and be sniffing me. And one day I thought, And so I started sniffing him back, right, and really smelling him from very close. And it took me into a completely different world. It took me into a wild world. So it was he was just fascinating.
He certainly was beautiful from the pictures, that's sure. Next question from Patty online. Can you talk about difficulties of re-entry into society?
Mm-hmm. In some ways, coming back was a lot harder than going. It's the same in traveling for those of you that have spent, extended periods of time in other cultures, especially third world cultures. Um, Adaptation, acclimatization is a challenge when you go, but coming back, in some ways, it's even harder because often when we're someplace away from where we normally live, we feel just vibrantly alive and caught up in the world. And we think, this is just how my life is going to be. And then we come back to the same old, and the filters unconsciously start coming up again, and the world becomes flat and sort of dead, and it just feels like, oh God. So that's always been a huge problem for me. The first time I went into the wilderness when I was in my late 20s for 3 months, I went through a very strong bout of depression for almost 2 years after. It was extremely challenging. And then I discovered meditation, Buddhist meditation, and that really helped. Not that it had the answers, but it gave me a technique that I could explore some of the stuff that was causing me such distress. This time I thought it wasn't such a problem because I'd been doing this solitary retreats for quite a number of years. And I thought it wasn't so hard that I'd come back and it just wasn't that bad. Um, I was editing my journal. It took me a long time to write my dissertation. I came back with almost 900 pages of journal notes, and I sat in front of my computer for a year, and I had no idea of how to turn this into a dissertation. And so I was getting pretty glum, and as I was reading the psychological, emotional, spiritual struggles I was going through, I finally woke up that I was, in a pretty dark place back in Vancouver. And so I started to see a psychiatrist, and I saw a psychiatrist once a week for a couple of years, and that helped quite a lot. So it's hard coming back. It's a really, really a challenge. There's two challenges. One is we try to bring what we had out there back, and that doesn't work because what helps us to be so alive in radical situations in solitude is going beyond our expectations of just being present with whatever's going on. And so trying to bring it back, to remember kind of a thing, it doesn't seem to work very well. But if we don't do that, and then we just fall into the same old, and don't try to do anything, that also doesn't work very well. So it's kind of a catch-22. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. Um, it to me, that's kind of the fundamental spiritual catch-22 is that the part that wants to be free is the same part of us that holds on. And so we're fighting against ourselves. And so for me, it's kind of like just struggling until I get exhausted and give up and finally surrender. And it's that surrender that's the key to the transformation. Uh, the problem is then I try to negotiate. I'll surrender so that I'll be free. And that doesn't work because that's not real surrender. So the Zen statement that I'm not sure at this point in my life that there is any such thing as permanent enlightenment. I kind of think that's possibly a confusion, the idea of a static state of bliss. Nothing is static as far as I can tell in the universe, certainly not anything in my inner world. Maybe some people find that. I've never met anybody that does. A lot of Western teachers in the last years have de-emphasized the idea of some permanent state of enlightenment, and the teaching is more on equanimity, is learning to be with whatever happens. So I really like the Zen statement that enlightenment, if there is such a thing, enlightenment is an accident. And all that spiritual practice can do is make us accident prone. And so for me, that's a really, really powerful and relaxing statement. You can't make it happen. So that what I went for to control that shift from small mind to big mind, I failed in that. But in that failure, I discovered something deeper.
Thank you for sharing. Next question from Michael. You had us at eating the cat. Our question is, do you feel the depth of what you learned from your solitude could be maintained with daily practices while living in society? If so, what would it be?
That's hard. That again is a bit reflective back to the last question of attempting to bring back this experience. The reason I was so incredibly depressed after my first 3 months in solitude, my late 20s, was I thought my life was just going to be light filled and wondrous forever and ever, amen. And it didn't happen that way. When I got back to people, I lost it all. And I thought that I was to blame, that I was a spiritual coward, that I didn't have the courage to follow that inner light. And when I finally started meditating, went to a meditation retreat, I told the teacher about this, and he really reassured me. He said, this is just part of the spiritual journey. There are these ups and downs, these ecstatic experiences. And like everything else, we need to let go of them. It's pretty easy to let go of a material thing, but it's very challenging to let go of inner experience, that feeling of wonder and light. He said, but we go on retreats and we have these ecstatic experiences, and then we come back and they go away. And so we can remember that we had them, but trying to cling to them is just another form of clinging, and it causes us pain. So what I try to do is just be present in my life. I still spend a month by myself in the wilderness every year. I get flown into a remote lake and set up a camp there. But for the most part, I just try to be present. And I think that is at the heart of it. Because if spirit exists, and sometimes I definitely directly feel the presence of something. I can't define it, I don't know what it is, but there's an experience of presence. And so if that presence exists anywhere, it has to exist everywhere, in the city, everywhere. And it's just that we have so many distractions in our lives that we lose track of coming and slowing down. And so at the heart of the practice is becoming still, is allowing ourselves to be just still in the moment. Our bodies and our minds are always active and moving. Sometimes in solitude, the inside of my head was as noisy as downtown Vancouver. And to be still with that, to develop the equanimity to just go, really noisy today in here, right? So I think daily practice, daily meditation practice is hugely valuable. I sit every day. I keep it simple. I feel like I'm a beginner. I always feel like a beginner. So basically, my mind still wanders a lot. I still get lost in discursive thinking. But what I attempt to do is just stay present, to use my breathing. If it's raining, especially the sound of the rain, sound of water, but just to be present to myself in the moment, in the world in the moment, however that is. I don't know if I really answered that question, but
Very good, thank you. Steve would like to know specifically, what was your dissertation thesis, excuse me.
the book that is in your library comes out of my dissertation. So this is the dissertation was Explorations of Solitude, I think, something like that. So basically, this book is the same as the dissertation, but non-academic. So I edited it, cleaned it up, shortened it, and I expanded the context to talk some more about my life, what took me into solitude. You can actually read my dissertation if you want online. It's on my website. The website is bobkull.org. And then there's a lot of photographs there. All the photographs I've used today are on the website. And there, if you go to a wilderness project, the dissertation's there as a PDF.
Thank you. Steve would also like to know if you read the book that we are reading for our One Book, One Valley, The Stranger in the Woods. And if you did, what did you think about Michael Knight?
I think I did. I think I read it years ago. The author interviewed me, I think, for the book, and I'm pretty sure that's how I knew about it. And I read it long ago. I don't remember a lot about it. It was a very different experience to kind of this feeling of being a fugitive, that I had the sense that he was kind of hiding all the time. And so it was really different. The idea of solitary confinement is also a very different experience. And so being forced into solitude is way different than choosing it. So when I watched the movie Castaway, was it, with Tom Hanks? My feeling was that they didn't know anything about solitude. He didn't know anything about solitude. The director, producer, they didn't know. because it's like he was not living in a living world. And his only possibility for relationship was with this surrogate human, this volleyball. And he didn't seem to get that he could have a relationship with the world in which he was embedded. So I don't remember whether Fugitive he had that talked much about that relationship with the kind of ecstatic relationship with the non-human world or not. So I may not have read it, but I think I did.
Thank you. Michael would like to know, I've heard people being nourished by the sun while in retreats such as yours. Did you notice changes in your nourishment during this time? You spoke of fish. What else was in your diet?
My fundamental diet was rice and beans. Took a ton of rice and beans. Oatmeal for breakfast. I took some peanut butter, had some cheese, but mostly it was staples. I ate rice and beans every day, and then fish whenever I could catch it. So there was a little puddle of groundwater that was hidden under the trees. The water table, when it wasn't actively raining, was, I don't know, maybe a foot below the surface. When it was actively raining, it was above the surface. And that puddle of groundwater was never more than a little bit over 40 degrees. And so I'd fillet fish and then put them in a container and float them in that puddle of groundwater. So I ate fish a lot. Um, I think darkness is weird. One of the things that startles me is how quickly here in Vancouver we go from winter solstice to the spring equinox, and I don't hardly notice the passing of time, and from equinox to the summer solstice. Those transitions of light were huge in the wilderness. It was just that was huge, huge. And I've often thought that if I hadn't known that the sun was coming back to me, I'd have been totally freaked out that the sun was falling further and further over the trees to the north until it wasn't coming through at all. I was living in shadow all the time, and I would have been really freaked if I hadn't known it was coming back. So yeah, when there were calm, sunny days and I could get out in the boat or the kayak and feel sun on my face, it was miraculous. It was wonderful. So I think so. I think that was probably just the absence of sun was an important thing. There's the book, I think it's called Alone, about what's his name, that went to the South Pole and wintered by himself. He went pretty crazy, and it wasn't clear whether he was poisoned with carbon monoxide from his stove or whether it was just lack of light. But sunlight is when I went to a 3-month meditation retreat years later, and I decided along the way that I was so addicted to being outdoors that I didn't feel alive inside, and I wanted to challenge that. And so I got loaned a room, and I covered the window, and I stayed inside a room in the dark for 10 days. Got somebody to leave a meal outside my door. And that was really a powerful experience of just focusing inwardly the whole time and realizing how alive I am as a human being, and it kind of broke that addiction to being outside. I still meditate outside every day, so but it's easy in Vancouver not to spend very much time outside in the winter.
Thank you. Right. That's all the questions I have in chat at the moment. If anyone would like to raise their hand, or we'll have a moment to see if any others pop up.
Oh, there's one I see.
Okay, here we have from Dustin.
Mhm.
In the end, what did you take away from your year in solitude? Did you succeed in not mythologizing it after the fact?
Who knows? Pretty hard to avoid mythologizing. One of the incredible things that we do as humans is we mythologize our lives. It's really incredible. And so we have these memories, these ideas of who we've been in our life. And we're kind of the heroes of our own lives or anti-heroes of our own lives. And then we often don't live up to our own standards in the actual daily world. And we get depressed and think we're not good enough and we're not doing what we should do. And it's, we compare who we actually are with this illusion, this mythology of who we pretend that we've been. And I think that, that's just daily practice, just long days and weeks and months and years of practice is slowly allowing ourselves to be who we are in the moment. and how wondrous we are as human beings. It's incredible. We have this very artificial notion, this identity of who we are. And when we slip into big mind and recognize that we're huge, that we're the universe, that all of the spacious wonder that we can experience as ourselves is really incredible. And that only happens in the moment. It doesn't happen thinking back or imagining the future. It's always going on right here, right now. And when we don't have that, the tendency is to grasp for it, and the grasping keeps us from slipping into it. So over and over, there's this sense that surrender is at the heart of spiritual practice. And that surrender is one of the things I struggled with during the years is what am I surrendering to? Like if I were in a monastery, I would surrender to the routine, etc. Or if I had a guru, I would surrender to the will of the guru. But what am I surrendering to? And little by little, I came to recognize that I'm surrendering to life. I'm surrendering to each moment as it is, and each moment who I am in the moment. And that's the fundamental surrender is to that life is always what it is. And that's really challenging for those of us involved in the environmental movement, because we feel like there's so much that needs to be done. And how can we just surrender and sit on our butts? But I don't think surrender means that, because part of who we are is this desire to work for positive change. And so at a deep level, we can surrender and allow everything to be just exactly what it is. And part of that is that we're working for change, and we're working to alleviate suffering. But if we don't live fully in the moment, just as we are and just as the world is, we've already lost the world. Right? So it's that that challenge of being present, and it's hard. It's hard to find that balance, because it always feels. I supervised a thesis, and he interviewed a bunch of pretty high, I wouldn't say important, but well-known environmentalists. And the amazing thing was that all of them felt that they hadn't done enough in their lives. And I kind of thought, I read this and I thought, well, what hope have I got? You know, guys like David Suzuki and man think that they haven't done enough. There's no way I'm ever going to feel like I've done enough. And that just seems to be part of the territory. And so that's also something to live with, that sense as we can never feel like we've done enough, that the world gives us so much.
Absolutely. Question from Michael, from his son, actually. How many chapters are in your book, and how did you choose the chapters?
Let's see. I don't know. I have to look. There's the year, and so there's 13 chapters in that, because I spent more than a year there. Actually, I spent almost a year and a month. And then, so there's those 13 chapters. And then in between, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 interludes that discuss the different conceptual aspects of solitude. So one's on journaling and storytelling, another is methods, solitude and meditation, a glance at other solitaries, dancing in the hallowed halls, about how to bring this experience into a PhD program, the urge to be alone, which is a more general discussion of solitude, and the distinction between solitude and aloneness and alienation and loneliness, and words that often just get clumped together, and that they're just very, very different words. There's an interlude on technology and desire, an interlude on spiritual practice, an interlude on small mind and big mind. Then there's a reentry section, an epilogue, and Patty's story. So the final chapter in the book is Patty's story that she wrote. I asked her if she would write it about her perspective on all of this. So, and then there's a lot of appendices. There's lists of all the food I took and all the tools and materials I took. There's maps and stuff. All of that's in there as well.
Thank you. How many pages, and are there many pictures?
Sorry, the pictures are on my website, right? So I decided early on that I wasn't going to try to put pictures in the book, because I'm always disappointed when I read a book and there are these kind of low quality black and white images. And I thought, hey, we've got the technology. So the book includes the link to my website, and there are all the photographs in this presentation are on my website. So they're kind of part of the book itself. There are 354 pages in the book, including the references and the lists and everything. In the text itself, there are 332.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, we've almost come to the end of our time. If anyone else has any final questions, please submit them in the chat now. Otherwise, we'll wrap up in 1 minute.
It's a pleasure. I really enjoyed this. This is great.
This was wonderful. Yes, we're getting lots of thank yous for doing this to our community. Please share our thanks. This was wonderful. Lots of positive feedback here in the chats.
Cool. Yeah, this is the first Zoom presentation I've ever done. I teach online, but so this was an experiment. So yeah, it was very cool. It's it felt sort of like being in solitude to not be seeing anybody, just speaking to the camera.
Yes. All right, friends and neighbors, if we don't have any further questions tonight, I'd like to express again our deepest gratitude for Bob for sharing his insight and experiences with us this evening. All of you for joining us online and asking your great questions. And finally, the Estes Valley Library Friends and Foundation for all they do to make our One Book, One Valley series and everything else we do here at the Estes Valley Library possible. Eric will be sending out a survey shortly about tonight's event so we can get your feedback on how tonight's presentation went. We'd love that if you could fill that out and tell us how we did. And finally, we have so many more great programs coming up related to One Book, One Valley. Our next speaker in our series on Solitude will be Michael Clifton on January 15th. He'll share his experiences of incarceration, as well as what he's been up to since his return to society a year ago. And on the 24th, Michael Finkel, the author of Stranger in the Woods, will be here in person. You can see all of our programming at estesvalleylibrary.org, and I'll put a link in the email to send out, and you can also pick up the One Book, One Valley bookmark and program schedule at either service desk of the library. Thank you all again for joining us, and have a great evening, everyone. We appreciate
Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate you sharing your evening with me. So thank you very much. It's been great. I really enjoyed it.